So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for the first session of our How to Look Good Native series. Today we're going to look at our Migrate and Transform approach to SAP transformation, obviously with all the good stuff that comes with the Azure native platform as well. Agenda's on the screen for you to have a quick look at. Today's speakers are Kieran Fitzgerald, Steve Stringer and Claire Richards. I'm not sure if you guys want to say a quick hello and introduce yourself.
Sure, yeah, I'll go first. Kieran Fitzgerald, Chief Sales Officer. So I've been at Centiq for over 10 years. So largely in that time been very much focused around SAP, particularly SAP HANA when it came to market about 10 years ago. That's been a big area of focus for us. But the last few years has been pretty much entirely dominated by Azure migrations, both as part of customers moving to S/4HANA or moving existing SAP ECC systems over into Azure. So thank you for your time and for joining us. Steve, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I'm Steve Stringer. I work alongside Kieran. I'm one of the technical architects, sort of enterprise architects working in the SAP on Azure space, yes.
I'm Claire Richards. I've been working in the SAP basis area since 1998. I've been with Centiq for about 5.5 years now. My current role is in Solution Services, Solutions Architect in the Sales and Design team.
Thanks, guys. Just to let you all know, the session is being recorded. We had a quick draw in earlier. So I think we'll probably take just over an hour of your time. And on that note, I will hand over to Chirag Patel from Microsoft to kick us off. You're on mute, mate.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today's session. I'm Chirag Patel. I'm the SAP and Azure go-to-market lead for the UK here at Microsoft. I'd like to thank you, but all of you for joining today. I think you'll find it a very fruitful event. You'll probably see a lot of good and interesting information around what it takes to move to Azure, the benefits you'll see compared to what the standard on-prem environments and other hyperscalers have, but also looking at sort of the whole innovation and sort of what can you do when you're in the cloud, because there's a lot of differences and a lot of changes, a lot more sort of flexibility that you can see when moving into Azure. I think today will be very interesting with our partner Centiq, who are one of our most progressive partners in the UK, and I've been working with Centiq now for over 3 years. Since I in fact joined Microsoft. So we've been through a lot of iterations together, done lots of different migrations together from different types of spins in terms of how we do things with SAP. And most recently, it's worth pointing out that Centiq have just achieved their advanced specialization, which is the highest specialization you can get around being certified around SAP and Azure. So you can definitely see that you're in able hands in terms of a partner that can actually understand how to migrate to Azure in the right way and the most efficient way. So thank you very much, and over to you, Kieran.
Brilliant, thank you, Chirag. So yeah, I just want to spend a couple of minutes framing up the session and introducing a couple of definitions that we're going to run through today. So as Chirag just mentioned, Centiq are one of 20 or so partners, Microsoft partners worldwide, who hold the SAP and Azure advanced specialization. And in simple terms, what that means is we've been involved in a lot of SAP cloud projects, and we've got a large amount of specialist expertise. So not only are we migrating our own customers to the cloud, but we also have been brought in on an advisory basis to support other SAP customers manage their migrations with perhaps more established but less specialist partners that they work with. This has given Centiq a pretty comprehensive view of the SAP cloud market. And we're here today to share the insight we've gained through those experiences. So throughout the session, we'll try and back this up with some evidence from the main analysts like Gartner and stuff like that, so that you can validate some of the points that we're making and feel confident in the feedback that we're sharing. So on that topic, it's our view that organizations are falling short of realizing their cloud adoption goals through suboptimal cloud migration strategies that focus on lift and shift. So lift and shift is exactly what it says on the tin. It's taking what you have today, so your system architecture and your operating model, and simply just moving it to the cloud. And this is a mistake, but it's an understandable mistake with a pretty simple explanation. That's a lack of skills. So most organizations outsource some or all of the migration and support requirements to SAP service providers, so the large GSIs or established IT partners being the most common fallback. And due to their size and much broader focus, it could be difficult for those organizations to develop cloud native skills, or perhaps even more specifically, SAP cloud native skills at the scale or speed that the market's demanding. And at this point, I'll prompt Bex to add a couple of links to this chat that include commentary from Gartner that reinforces those points. On the flip side, we're seeing organizations more successfully realizing their cloud adoption goals by migrating and transforming as they move to the cloud. So these organizations are modernizing the application landscape where it makes sense to do so, and completely transforming the way that they build and run infrastructure for the cloud, and treating SAP much more like a cloud native system. So we're going to spend this afternoon looking at these strategies in both the application and infrastructure level in much more detail. But before we do, I felt it was appropriate to take a quick step back and provide a bit more context with regards to what's actually going on in the SAP market right now. So most of us are probably familiar with this meme. It's pretty tongue-in-cheek, obviously, and I think it captures the impact of COVID-19 on businesses perfectly. So, but digital transformation means lots of different things to lots of different people. So what is actually happening? So this study from Gartner highlights the impact in a little bit more detail. I won't talk through all the points or the study. The link will be in the slides that we'll distribute. But I'm going to call out the sort of the top 3 focus areas for organizations as part of that digital transformation. So the study highlighted that at board level, the top priority is the acceleration of digital business initiatives to drive innovation. The second focus is on improving operational excellence. And the third is to drive higher levels of cost optimization. I'm going to come back to these later, and there'll be a theme pretty much throughout the session. Ultimately, this is all about organizations being more resilient, being more agile so that they can respond effectively to market threats, but also to leverage emerging opportunities and ways to better serve their customers. So I'll give you a quick example. One of our customers, the Body Shop, for our global audience, they're part of Natura Group. They've just implemented S/4HANA in Azure, and they've seen their Body Shop at home business grow from contributing to 88% of their sales in 2019 to a huge 25% in 2020. And the projections are that it will grow even further in 2021. To cater for that new demand, in early 2020, they managed to deploy a dedicated distribution center and the supporting technologies in just 8 days, and made only possible really by cloud, which kind of leads me on nicely to the next point. So according to a study by Synergy Research Group, in 2020, organizations effectively spurred on by the impact of COVID-19, spent more on cloud infrastructure services than data center hardware and software for the very first time. This trend is set to continue, with businesses recognizing that the cloud will help them streamline operations and function far more effectively moving forward. Once the pandemic recedes, cloud innovations will remain essential for any business, just like we've highlighted with the Body Shop. In other words, adopting the cloud won't just help the business run better today, it will help those businesses innovate so they can continue to transform over time. For that reason, it's not really a surprise that you can see here Gartner predicting infrastructure service spend to nearly double by 2022, which is just the second row here on the bottom. So in summary, organizations are accelerating those digital transformation initiatives to drive operational efficiencies and cost optimization. But these initiatives aren't alone to really thrive in the new normal. I'm sorry to say that so quickly into presentation. Being able to innovate effectively and efficiently to ensure customers can better serve their own customers is the number 1 priority, and will be sustainably for the future. With unparalleled levels of agility and scalability, cloud is understandably one of the critical foundations of that. And again, that Body Shop example is a perfect illustration of this. So where does SAP fit into all of this? So I'm sure most of you are probably aware, in January 2021, SAP extended the S/4HANA migration deadline by 2 years. Sadly, for all of us, 1 month later, the impact of COVID hit, and most customers' immediate plans to move to S/4HANA ground to pretty much a halt. So for a lot of those customers, the additional 2 years gained have essentially been burned already, and that grace period has all but vanished. With approximately 85 to 90% of SAP customers worldwide still running ECC 6, SAP recently announced the Rise with SAP program, which is the launch of their business transformation as a service offering. So long story short, this is a go-to-market play by SAP to accelerate migration to S4 and to make up for lost time. I've heard a number of SAP sellers state that they've been told that whatever the customer question or need is, the answer is Rise. So time will tell how that strategy plays out with customers. So in summary, there's more pressure than ever on IT teams to accelerate transformation, and the cloud is a launch pad of that innovation for the future. The vast majority of SAP's customers are running on ECC on-premise. These systems, as we all know, are typically very monolithic in nature, slow to change, very expensive to run, and for that reason, SAP is prime for transformation. The S4 deadline adds further complexity to organizations looking to determine the most optimal roadmap for their cloud transformation. So that's the analysts and SAP, but what about the most important group within the SAP ecosystem? So no, not the partners, it's of course the customers. So as I mentioned earlier, approximately 10-15% of SAP customers have moved to S4HANA already. That sort of higher figure comes from the latest Q2 figures announced by SAP earlier this week. So according to a report in December 2020 by the UK&I SAP user group and Constellation Research, the group based out of the US, approximately just 1/4 of organizations plan on moving to S4HANA in the next 1 to 2 years, whilst the vast majority, so 2/3 of SAP customers, either plan to move in 3 years or have no plans at all. So this was the UK SAP user group. I think is fairly similar across both the German and the American user groups that are typically the ones that show what's going on worldwide. And so there's similar numbers and similar trends globally as well. So yeah, the question facing those sort of 2/3 of SAP customers right now is, how do I develop an optimal transformation roadmap around cloud and S4 that enables me to realize the levels of innovation and efficiencies and cost optimization at the speed that the business demand without waiting for 4 or 5 years for a potential inflection point in the SAP strategy. For those looking to move in the next 1 to 2 years, they're asking, how do I navigate through the increasing number of hosting options and ensure we leverage the full power of cloud as part of that S4 transformation program? At this point, I'm going to hand over to Steve for a couple of slides. You want to take control, Steve?
Yep. If I can, please.
Approved. Yeah.
Yeah. So, as Kieran mentioned, really, we've got three different bits of ERP in play, running simultaneously throughout SAP customers. We've still got lots of customers and speak to a lot of people running ECC on any supported database other than HANA, so Oracle, SQL, DB2, all this kind of stuff. And we've got customers running Suite on HANA. And for most of those customers, at some point before 2027, they need to be all the way over on the right and running S4 if the dates don't change. But I don't think anyone can bank on them changing, really. I think we need to take it as a serious deadline. But obviously, anyone running ECC on any DB, have I got control? Yes, I have. They can go straight to S4. However, we do see customers going to ECC on HANA, Suite on HANA as a sort of stopgap, so less functional change and things staying a bit more as they were. But eventually, everyone needs to go to S4 before that deadline. And so that seems pretty straightforward in terms of the available paths to go. But then also thrown into the mix is the fact that you could be running on-prem, you could be running hosted, or you could already be in the public cloud. Now, as Kieran mentioned earlier, most customers, most businesses out there are investing more and more in the cloud, and that amount of on-prem spend is going down. So we can assume that most customers will end up in the public cloud or in a hosted service of some sort. So what the options with all this that's combined? So you can always find a new platform for your current ECC. So you can go from on-prem up to the public cloud or up to hosted, or from hosted onto the public cloud. That's not a problem. There's some customers that are upgrading their ERP system in place, so not changing the platform and just changing their software. But more or less, we see a lot of customers doing an upgrade and migration at the same time. And then this is where the graph gets really confusing and really messy as the lines go everywhere. We did originally try this slide all superimposed with all the migration paths in different colors, but it was a bit crazy. The design agency said it looked rubbish. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of different options, within the options, if you like. And I think it's our job to sort of simplify that. And this is really where we're working. We're working in the public cloud, specifically with Azure, to make if this top row is your target, this is where we're working with, and there's great things that we can do with your peer.
Yeah, absolutely.
And with that, I'll hand control back.
Thank you. Yeah, just to give a bit of extra context as well. So Centiq as a business has been in the SAP infrastructure space for 20 years. Public cloud for SAP has only really been around for a few years. So historically, our legacy has been in that bottom box. So we know it well. We've run systems in there for customers for 10, 15 years, and our focus is in that top box now for good reason, is that the customer experience that you can offer is really unparalleled. So this is really why there's a big focus for us. We weren't born in the cloud, but as a business, we have that experience of seeing customers run both. It really is no comparison in our perspective, and kind of we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail. So I think I've got control back now. So yeah, I think, obviously that last slide kind of nicely summarizes what a very complex, perhaps overwhelming choice customers face right now. I think that's the underlying theme that we're hearing from customers that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. There's too much choice, there's more choice. There's the SAP RISE presentation has got about 10 different flavors in there as well. So organizations are trying to determine the right strategy for the business when it comes to building their SAP and cloud roadmap. And I think it's fair to say that we're now starting to see the market split into two main adoption strategies when it comes to cloud. So the first, as I mentioned earlier, that those sort of 20% of organizations that are planning to move to S/4HANA immediately, it makes sense to sweat your existing assets and then leverage the cloud to support that S4 transformation, and so that your new platform becomes part of that program. But the 60 to 70% that have got no plans to move, they need to do something. They need to optimize. They need to be able to innovate faster. They need to improve operational efficiencies. Doing nothing is an option, but it's certainly not going to help achieve those goals. And we're seeing these organizations now look to migrate SAP ECC into the public cloud and then move to S/4HANA a bit later on. And we're going to cover the benefits for that second phase in a little bit more detail later today as well. So skipped ahead a little bit there by accident. So yeah, that concludes this piece here. Now I'm going to pass over to Claire's, a bit of a whistle stop tour of what's going on. We've covered the why, so why are companies migrating SAP systems to the cloud? But one of our customers recently said to me last week, it's really the how, the what that determines whether you achieve the goals laid out in the why. So on that basis, during the rest of this session, we're going to tackle the important questions. So regardless of the ECC and S4 strategy of my business, as a customer under immense pressure to leverage these benefits of the cloud, how do I ensure that we sustainably realize those benefits? So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Claire, and you can take over for a while.
Oh, it just said you didn't get control. Let me try that again.
There you go. I was chatting away, not looking at the screen. There you go.
There we go. Okay, so remember this slide from earlier. I'm going to try and break down the lift and shift and the migrate and transform approaches in a little bit more detail. So lift and shift is often seen as the quick win option. It involves making minimal changes in terms of infrastructure design and application modifications, ideally none at all. You'd only look to change components that wouldn't be supported in Azure, for example. Although, having said that, some customers aren't even doing that, are they, Steve?
No, as Kieran mentioned, excuse me, as Kieran mentioned earlier, not only do we build and support landscapes for customers, we also sometimes get involved in reviewing other people's designs, and we have seen a couple of designs come across the desk, if you like, where largely the GSIs of, it's like a disco.
Sorry.
Where it is largely the GSIs who have tried to move everything exactly as it is, and that sometimes involves putting operating systems into Azure that simply aren't supported there. So doing this completely at their own risk. So cutting down the risk of anything changing, but introducing a whole new risk altogether, which is if you've got a problem, nobody will help.
Yeah. So lift and shift is generally quicker to migrate than to move than migrate and transform, and it's lower impact. By maintaining the same architecture and technology stack, you are minimizing testing and any additional training, so it also tends to be the least costly. However, this approach is rarely optimal. Simply replicating this monolithic architecture from on-prem into the cloud can prove expensive. You've got this minimal use of the native elasticity and the resources, and it just creates inefficiencies with regards to the cost of compute and memory and storage. And after all that, it might not even perform as needed. So you also aren't addressing any technical debt with this approach. You're just moving it to the cloud. And so those costs can be further magnified. So whilst lift and shift seems to be the easiest path to the cloud, you do need to be aware of the strong potential for an increase in cost if you just try and operate in exactly the same way as before. Running VMs in your own data center or colo just masks inefficiencies because they're all part of that CapEx for your compute, storage and network. When you move to the public cloud, you will pay for every reserved CPU that isn't utilized, for every bit of storage that isn't used, and for any other idle resources. Now, the scope of a migrate and transform project will depend massively on your starting point. Some source environments might just need small tweaks to the infrastructure design, but if you've got quite old or diverse source environments, then it could be significantly more complex. It might even require staggering migrations over multiple weekends rather than a big bang cutover. But you can always do some degree of infrastructure transformation, and you should aim to do so to leverage cloud benefits from day one. Application transformation is optional, depending entirely on the current state and the future roadmap. But you should be taking into account things like Suite on HANA, BW for HANA, and S for HANA. The migrate and transform approach ultimately provides an opportunity to review what the organisation actually needs, reduce the size and the number of instances perhaps, move to a more strategic platform, maybe in readiness for S4, for example, but crucially, that transformation can occur during the same downtime window as the move to Azure. Now I'm going to try, click, there we go. Just bear with it. There we go. Okay, it's a little bit of a delay on my end, I'm sorry. So to bring this to life a little bit, I wanted to share an example of a customer who we have gone through a process comparing the lift and shift and migrate and transform approaches. So this customer came to us as they were looking to migrate to the cloud due to their existing hardware going end of life, but they aren't quite ready for the move to S4 yet. So they see this move to Azure as a stepping stone on their S4 journey. So these guys already really appreciate the speed and the flexibility that a move to Azure would give them with regards to facilitating a conversion to S4 in the future. Just having that ability to spin up a POC or a sandbox, being able to scale up your VMs to facilitate a faster conversion time, scale it back down again afterwards, etc. So this is quite a good example because they're using several of the more common components, and it's a pretty standard representation of a customer landscape that we see. You've got multiple SAP products in there, different DBs, we've got a bit of SQL, HANA, ASE, and then on the OS, we've got some Windows, we've got some SLES in there, different versions, different patch levels. Now, with this example, moving as is, lift and shift, even here, you will see a difference actually, because we recommended dropping the pre-prod tier from the Azure side, because after some analysis of the requirements and the current usage of pre-prod, there just wasn't the justification to warrant its immediate creation in Azure. They can be recreated later when needed. And even if you did need to keep the pre-prod tier from day one for load testing, for example, there's no point really migrating it. You would just recreate it as a fresh copy of production once you've moved it over into Azure. You don't want to be complicating your downtime window with something like that you can create at another time. And another point to note here is that this just shows the component view, but there were also lots and lots of massively over-spec'd app servers as well, scattered throughout the landscape rather randomly, which we've omitted entirely from the Azure design because they were just unnecessary. So even through a lift and shift option, we would still reduce VMs where appropriate, but we're not making any changes. An important point to note is that we are seeing lots of customers still running NetWeaver 7.4 stacks, despite the fact that NetWeaver 7.4 is technically supported in Azure, so you could do a lift and shift. It's not supported by SAP since the 31st of December 2020, except for SAP Business Suite 7 core applications, so ERP6, CRM, SCM, SRM7. So this customer had just completed the process of upgrading some of their NetWeaver stacks to 7.5. So prior to that, this picture would have looked quite different, and their route to Azure as a lift and shift might not have been quite so straightforward. As it stands today, all of these systems are technically supported in Azure as is and by SAP. There are no application level changes necessary. You might choose to update the ECC NetWeaver stack, but you don't have to because it's under the extended maintenance. However, if you've got a PO dual stack, for example, on NetWeaver 7.4, so ABAP and Java, you need to be looking to upgrade that because that's not supported. You might not have the resources or the capacity to do that locally. So you might need to move that as is to Azure and then upgrade it as a follow-on step because it is technically supported. So you could move it, but then upgrade it. And a real big gotcha is the Java stack on a Solman 7.4 system is not supported. The ABAP stack is, but the Java stack isn't. So you can see already, it's a bit of a minefield, and there's a really useful OSS now about NetWeaver 7.4 and all of the nuances of what is and what isn't supported. So even just a lift and shift isn't always as straightforward as you might think. There's lots of notes and lots of guides that you need to read to make sure everything is supported and that you can do a lift and shift. So the pros of a lift and shift are around minimising change and any subsequent remediations that might be required as a consequence of that change. You're minimising the impact to the end users in terms of testing and possible changes to the way the system looks or the processes. And it's relatively quick to move to a new platform. Some of the cons are that the environment is often not cost optimized if you do just move it entirely as is. Often it's not tuned correctly for optimal performance. There's no review. People forget to review these parameters when they move the platform. And the business isn't seeing any change or improvement for all this downtime. And if you're really unlucky, the system might even be slower after you've moved it if you don't look at any of the parameters, etc. And ultimately, it doesn't take you any further forward on a roadmap to S4 or Suite on HANA. So let's have a look at what this scenario might look like if we did some transformation as part of the move to Azure. So this is a single step transformation, moving it to Azure and changing things at the same time. So in this example, the act here is pretty up to date actually. So the transform elements that we were looking to incorporate into the Azure migration are around standardizing the database across the board to HANA and standardizing the operating systems across the board to SLES. So you might have noticed that ECC and BW are already on HANA here. However, if they were on another DB, then you would just use the DMO and sum tool to change the DB and move to Azure in one step, just like the GRC and the Gateway Fiori systems there. But you could also upgrade that NetWeaver stack and apply a support pack stack if you really wanted to, all at the same time. Now, clearly, the more you do in a single step, the longer the downtime window required and the higher the risk. So be aware as well that if you have a large database, you cannot use the downtime optimized features of DMO with the system move option. You'd have to move to Azure as is first and then use optimized DMO to change the database. So it gets back to all these layers on top of this. So again, when you're looking at Java stack systems as well, so PO and Solman in this case, you can only use some version 1.0 with a Java stack, but that only supports a target NetWeaver stack of 7.4 or lower. Well, these are on 7.5, so you have to use some 2.0, but that doesn't support Java. So you've got to do a heterogeneous system copy. So we've got some more tools being added into the mix here. So you see these layers of complexity coming in. And you might notice that we've not recommended upgrading the ECC NetWeaver stack here as part of this migrate and transform. You can just move some things as is, that's okay. That's because this customer is looking at an S4 conversion in the next 12 to 18 months. So there's no point in upgrading the NetWeaver stack at this point and going through all that testing and work. The important thing to remember really is that you don't have to transform everything to the fullest degree possible. Even some low-level transformations, just moving the database, for example, can make a significant difference and take you that next step further. So the pros of this approach mainly are around standardization, standardizing the platform. And that means that we can simplify the support and we can reduce the support costs going forward. And also being S4 ready, being ready in terms of your roadmap. It's that stepping stone. Some of the cons are around the complexity, can be more complex to migrate and transform. It depends entirely on your scope of transformation. Also, the number of the different migration tools that are required. So you have a number of different skill sets that are needed to manage such a transformation. And again, it could require significant testing, and there might be a large amount of change and some remediation required, again, depending entirely on the level of customization and the scale of transformation which you're going to undertake. And these things can elongate the timescales of a migrate and transform migration. Okay. So on the previous slide, I mentioned there being a number of different tools available for migrating and transforming systems. These are just some of the more common ones. There are a huge array of third-party products that can help you with migrations, especially around minimizing downtime if you have a very large system to move or if you're in a very tight downtime window. And there are SAP services as well that you can pay for that can help you with this. Each of these tools has its own use case, restrictions, prerequisites. Read the notes, and then you can try and work out which one best suits your circumstances. More than likely, you will have to use a number of these. Okay, so in terms of some things to consider with the migrate and transform strategy, running multiple transformations in a single step reduces the number of outages required, but it increases the downtime required and it increases the risk. You can minimise that risk a little bit through running repeated dry runs, so you can fine-tune those steps and you can iron out any issues, you can work out the tuning and the timing so there's no surprises when it comes to cutover. You should redesign the systems to optimise costs, and you can do this through only deploying additional app servers on demand when required, only turning on pre-prod systems for periods of load testing, for example, and not having them sitting there idle for the rest of the time. And also using HANA tenants for smaller systems. These HANA VMs can be quite expensive, so look at using HANA tenants. Just consider which systems sit well together and which don't when you're looking at tenants, because they don't always play nicely together. And migrate per tier is where you would move all of your dev systems first. So you'd move BW dev, ECC dev, gateway dev, and you might do that because you want to complete full integration testing, for example. We've seen this with customers who have very, very complex integrations and interfaces, and it's really important if moving the landscape that all has to go at the same time. So that's why they would look at that approach. Migrate per landscape is moving all of your ECC systems first, for example, before moving BW. Again, each of these is suited to different scenarios and has different constraints and different requirements around change freezes, etc. Speaking of change freezes, your strategy and approach will be influenced by how long a change freeze can be tolerated for, and also how long an outage window or how many outage windows are available. Consider what mechanism will be used to transfer these files around and the other associated files and directories, because you are reliant on performant bandwidth to facilitate the transfer of data within your downtime window. Some migration tools require space and resources on the source system to run. Do you have sufficient spare capacity to ensure no impact or minimal impact to the productive services? Could you reallocate from elsewhere, non-production, for example? Now, with regards to remediation and tuning, it is likely that some will be required, even if you just move the database to HANA, for example. HANA mini checks, the early watch alert health check can be run to assist this in your non-prod systems. You need to ensure that the act here is optimized for HANA, so review any hints, etc. Otherwise, you could get performance issues. Again, you use your dry runs and you practice all of this beforehand, you do benchmarking tests, etc. Okay, there we go. In the example shown earlier, the migration strategies were very similar in terms of cost from a technical perspective. The effort in the migrate and transform approach comes from the testing and the remediations, and that's dependent entirely on the scope of transformation that you undertake. The delivery timescales of the two approaches will vary depending on scope. Generally, though, a lift and shift would be a shorter migration period. But you also need to consider the longer term costs. So, for example, by standardising the platform, it's much easier to manage, and therefore our managed services costs are reduced. We can use repeatable processes and automation for patching, monitoring, and alerting, for example. The example customer that I've talked about today in the scenario slides, the overall build and run TCO reduced by over 20% with the migrate and transform approach. That was a 7-figure saving over a 3-year period. So don't rule it out because it might be hard. And in terms of a recommendation, to realise optimisation of legacy SAP landscapes in the cloud, migration strategies must focus on standardisation, rationalisation, modernisation and automation to achieve those cloud adoption goals. And Steve is going to be going into more depth on these 4 pillars in the next section of this presentation momentarily. Centiq strongly recommends the migrate and transform approach to support that accelerated innovation, to improve operational excellence, and to drive those high levels of cost optimization. So on that note, I will now hand over to Steve, who is going to talk you through building SAP infrastructure in Azure.
Thank you, Claire. Oh, can you pop on mute, Claire? Thank you very much. Cheers, Claire. And what's even better is I remember to come off mute, which is also beneficial, isn't it? Does it seem to take a while to change slide? Let me try again. That seems better, unless I've done it twice. Yeah, so I'm going to be focusing here on a little bit on the Azure infrastructure. We're not going to be going into loads and loads of detail about exactly how these things are built. We're going to be focusing on some of the broader themes about infrastructure and some of the bigger ideas, if you like. So as the other guys have said, we've been building SAP systems, as a company for over 20 years. So we've got a lot of experience. But when it came to first building in Azure, we didn't just want to do what we'd done before. So we took it as a chance to look back on what we'd done using on-prem architecture, using virtualization, on x86, and even stuff that we used to do on Power a very long time ago. And we saw it as an opportunity to review that, see what worked and see what didn't. We also had an opportunity to look at exactly what Azure could offer us in terms of best practice, as in terms of reference architecture, but we also looked a bit more broadly at the market and looked at cloud adoption more broadly as well. So we wanted to make SAP feel as native as an application like SAP can feel in the public cloud. And when we looked at sort of these broader trends through DevOps and a whole other bunch of ideas that were going around, we came up with something called the 4 pillars. So the 4 pillars, come on, are on the next slide. Let's try again. You might need to advance these for me, Kieran. Oh, no, we got there. Okay. No, we didn't. We went about 4 slides in advance. Oh, dear.
There you go.
I think And yeah, there we go. So these are the 4 pillars. This is what we base our ideas on. So the idea of standardization, rationalization, modernization, and automation. So everything we do, we need to be focused in these areas, and I'll talk about them in a bit more detail in the next couple of slides. So standardization, as Claire sort of mentioned when she was talking in some detail, is all about promoting simplicity. Many of the customer landscapes that we see are very diverse, based on best practice at the time, because people who run SAP have been doing so for many years, and their best practice changes. But with SAP, you get long infrastructure life cycles on-prem. So two systems that run alongside each other may have been implemented 2 or 3 years apart. So they may be on different technology, different OSs, different databases, using different tools, maybe even supported by different teams, which never helps things. So when we migrate systems into Azure, we want to promote simplicity. We want to create a uniform system. So have the systems built and configured in a similar way as possible. Now, not every system, because things do different things, there are different sizes and solve different problems. There's always some changes between these systems, but we get them as uniformed as we can. And that means that rather than having 5 or 6 operating systems, well, 4 or 5 databases to support, or many operating systems to support, and lots of backup tools to support, and different types of storage, we can really focus in on getting really good at the smaller subset of technology we support. And that makes running systems easier. And that easiness, if you like, translates to lower cost and less complexity. Well, less complexity is often lower cost as well. And then we also talk about rationalization. So rationalization is all, as it says on screen, it's all about doing more with less. So that comes into things like right size and tight sizing. It also comes into things like snoozing systems. As Claire said, does the pre-prod system need to be up all the time? If it's cost beneficial to only power it up when it's needed, then that's something that we can do. But also lots of landscapes that we look at, which are built up over time, they've got very strange systems that often don't need to be in the landscape, like sandbox systems that are always powered up. That's not needed in Azure. If you want a sandbox, you can create a sandbox. There's end of year systems, reference systems, and so we see where we can reduce waste and answer those questions with better solutions rather than just having static systems that do nothing. Modernisation. Modernisation is a very broad topic when we talk about SAP. The first thing we want to do with modernisation is get customers to embrace Azure, not just lift and shift their old way of doing it, bringing a bunch of file servers into Azure that we could replace with native systems, custom DNS, things like that, their own backup tools, their own security tools. We can take a lot of the native stuff directly from Azure and reduce all this third-party need and reduce costs. But also we want customers to embrace change. We talked about technical debt before in this presentation. I'll touch on it again in the next couple of slides. But when customers move to Azure, they go often from what they assume is this perfectly safe on-prem environment where they've got their SAP systems buried under a whole load of VNets and virtual networking and such, and they think it's secure, and moving it into the cloud is somehow less secure. Well, that's a bit of a misnomer in many respects. But what we like to do is when we move stuff into Azure is enhance the security and make it visible. So it's one thing being told something's secure, being able to see it secure gives you that benefit. It takes away those doubts. The final pillar is automation. So automation is great. I'm going to talk about it a bit more later, but we use automation not just to build system. It's relatively simple to build systems with automation. But then if what you do afterwards is go onto that system manually and do everything else once it's built manually, you're really losing a lot of those benefits of automation, which are increasing consistency and eliminating human error. And again, we'll touch on these slides in these topics in a little bit more detail in just a sec. But those 4 pillars are great, but really they are just ideas. What we've done is create a service called CFI, which is Centiq Future Infrastructure, which is the build and run service that really uses the 4 pillars as its base. So with CFI, we've taken all those ideas and sort of productized it, if you like. So what I'm going to talk about now is how those 4 pillars really work with these with CFI. So in terms of standardization, exactly as Claire said earlier, we've got on the left our SAP customers running on-prem or hosted, even some customers running HEC. They've got systems that feel more or less cobbled together sometimes. Lots of different tools, lots of different operating systems or different versions of the same operating system, different databases. What we want to do is bring them under the CFI and run them in Azure. And when we do, they go into the CFI factory, inverted commas, and they come out looking slightly like a Greg's logo, but also looking a lot more uniform. But it's important to realize that they're uniformed to themselves, but also there's a broad similarity in all of our customers that run in Azure. That's hugely beneficial to us. As we mentioned earlier, it means that we've got a really tight skill set and we know a lot about all the stuff that we support, rather than, you know, supporting bits and pieces that nobody's too sure on. So it means that we can offer a really good service, but because we don't have to support hundreds of products, you know, it can be done at a lower cost. So to give you a flavor of the standardization that we've got in CFI, I'll go through some of the big ticket items, if you like. So the platform is Azure. CFI is not available on anything else. We don't do it in VMware or on-prem with this type of vendor. It's something that only exists in Azure. In terms of operating systems, we support SLES for SAP applications and Windows Server. So in Azure, you can run Linux, you can run Windows, and we've got a brand of Linux that we support, and we support Windows Server too. For databases, we support SAP HANA, SQL Server, and Azure SQL. So HANA is obviously there to support things like Suite on HANA, BW on HANA, and S4. For customers that either aren't on HANA yet, then we've got the disk-based SQL Server. And in some cases, we can even use Azure SQL for some databases for SAP. Things like the Business Objects SIM database can run on Azure SQL if you're on a late enough version of BI. For storage, there's lots of storage options in Azure. You can use standard disk, standard SSD. You can use ANF, Azure NetApp files, but we've standardized on Azure Premium Storage for everything we support. Now that gives you the advantage of price predictability. Some of the standard storage in Azure, the price fluctuates based on IOPS. You don't get that with Azure Premium Storage. Azure NetApp Files is a really good product, but it is very expensive. It does simplify some provisioning tasks, but for that simplification, it costs a lot of money. As we said earlier, we do some config reviews for other people, some design reviews for third parties, and we had one the other day using Azure NetApp Files, and we figured by replacing it with Azure Premium Storage, they would save £1 million over 5 years. So it is significant, these decisions, and you need a really good understanding. Now, ANF might take away some complexity, but if it's all managed by Centiq, it's all going to work anyway. So it's not something that our customers need to worry about. So we have standard sort of t-shirt sizes for availability. We can go standalone, we can cluster, we can cluster across availability zones in Azure. And each one of those has its unique uptime SLA. And for disaster recovery, we rely on Azure Site Recovery and database log shipping as well. We back up with a single tool, Azure Backup, that has native plugins for SAP HANA and Azure SQL. So you can kind of see the correlation between the standardization and how all these decisions come about. So everything that we do can all be backed up by the one tool. And for monitoring, we use the Azure native monitoring tools, as well as our own Centiq Optic tool, which has got some really unique features for, especially around HANA right now. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about rationalization. So I'm trying to go reasonably quick, but not too rushed. So most people who work in SAP or any sort of infrastructure are aware of this phenomenon that you get when you do stuff on-prem or with a hosted partner. You'll have a sort of usage profile of your systems, SAP or whatever, really, that kind of grows over time. The actual wiggly line of the graph isn't displayed here, but as you run over time, your capacity generally increases, whether that's storage or whether that's sort of CPU and memory. Over time, your systems grow and get busier. But what you generally find in the on-prem world, or with virtualization or hosted, what you've actually deployed to run that workload is generally quite a lot bigger than what you're actually using. And one of the reasons for this is if you don't grab these resources for your project right away, somebody else will grab it for theirs, and it's gone. It's not yours anymore. It's not claimable. So people tend to over provision the systems that they run. And of course, when you're working in a hosted or virtual environment on-prem, you're operating within the constraints of the amount of kit that you've bought, and that is your glass ceiling, if you like. You can't go through that. Now, some people might call this free space. I tend to call it innovation, because in that free space, that's where you can do interesting things for your SAP project, for example. If you want to spin up a sandbox to try out an S4 migration, or just make a vanilla S4 system to see how it looks and feels, if you want to do some really, really big load testing, that all needs to happen in the space you've got available. Now, there's this paradox here, really, isn't there? Because once you've just implemented your systems, that's when you've got the most free space, innovation space to be able to do anything. By the time you get to the end of the infrastructure life cycle, that's when you want to start try sandboxing new solutions and stuff like that. Well, if you've done okay, you might have some left, but if you've planned poorly, you might have nothing left for innovation. So in Azure, we do it completely differently. What we do is we take what is being used and we model that, and then we deploy just enough. So over time, we'll increase the resources as we go along. But what we're aiming to do is right size these systems, or even tight size them. So giving them enough capacity that they can do their jobs within their SLAs, but not try and exceed that in any way. We want things, because we pay for usage in Azure, we want that payment to be as low as we can. But in terms of innovation, it opens up, hyperscale opens up a whole new world. Whenever we want to do something different, whether it be at the beginning or the end of a life cycle, we've got available space to do that. We're in hyperscale. So if we want to spin up a 6 terabyte HANA VM to do a sandbox trial, we can do that. If we want to do some load testing, there's resources always available. It's completely different to on-prem. So that is just one of the aspects of rationalization that we do on a sort of daily basis as part of the managed service. The next thing I want to talk about is modernization. And again, like I said, this is a really broad topic, and I've only really got time today to focus on one aspect. But if anyone does want a more in-depth session on the 4 pillars or CFI, I'd be happy to take them up on that. But most of us are probably familiar with this graph. Over time, change happens within systems. So when I'm talking about change and technical debt, I'm talking of things like implementing change, implementing newer versions of your operating system, database updates, driver updates, critical patching, that kind of thing. So over time, you create a backlog of all these things that you haven't done, all these things that you haven't implemented that you really should do. And what typically happens with an SAP system, it can take 12 months, 18 months to go from planning it to actually implementing it, whether that's a new system or a migration of a system. And then to do that, and a month later, somebody comes up in the change board and says they want to install a bunch of patches, that's not often met with relish and delight. This system that took 18 months to implement, let's change it straight away. So often with SAP systems, quite wrongly, change gets kicked down, the can gets kicked down the road, and people don't tend to change things unless it becomes desperate. So like the database goes out of support, or the operating system that thing runs on is about to go out of support. And then what happens is you need to implement loads and loads of change all in one hit. Everything needs to get up to date. So, the operating system might go out of date, but that also means the old database isn't supported on the new operating system, or the SAP kernels aren't supported, and lots of change needs to be put in at once. And this is where people get nervous. There's lots of change. Maybe it takes the plans for the change of 20 hours over the weekend. You've got 25 SMEs on site doing this change. You've got a massive backup plan. The company gets nervous. There's loads of risk involved. And if it all goes fine, what happens again after that? Well, nobody dreams of changing the system again because this was such a nightmare. And then the cycle just repeats itself in another 4-5 years' time. So with the CFI, we have a different approach to change. We go the little and often approach. With this way, we change the systems frequently. We update systems frequently, software patches, database patches, SAP kernels, that kind of thing. These get implemented so you're more in line with what the vendor strategy is. This has got multiple advantages. Firstly, these changes are simple and they are short and they are low risk because you are only changing a small amount of stuff. So any downtime related to the changes is kept to a minimum. Often with clustered systems, we don't need downtime. But the downtime and the change and the risk is kept to a minimum. And then we repeat the cycle. Now, sometimes customers can be nervous about frequent changes, but over time, as many frequent changes happen month by month, and the customer sees and the business sees that actually these small changes are good, we're keeping up to date, we're not falling years behind, then the business confidence in this whole process is increased dramatically. And the business goes from rejecting the idea of change to embracing that idea of change. And just to give you some idea of what these vendor strategies are like. I mean, for example, if we take SLES for SAP, every 4 or 5 years, SUSE create a new major version of SLES. And then within each year they'll create a new service pack for that system. And individual security patches and updates are released practically every day for SLES as a whole. So the best practice is always to be on the latest major release pack as soon as it's supported by SAP. As soon as the newest service pack is supported by SAP, move to that and install those patches frequently. So if you're not doing that, if the service that you have at the minute, whether it's in-house or whether it's by a third party, if you're not hitting that best practice, then you are basically increasing technical debt. You're saving up pain that you're going to have to take at some point later. And if we look at HANA, again, it's a similar picture. So every year there's a feature release of HANA. So we saw a feature release once when they went from version 1 to version 2, but most years it's a service pack update. And then once you get the new service pack update, the one before it has 12 months of life left before it goes into support. And then periodically over the year, there'll be a number of fixes. So again, the best practice would be to be on that latest release as soon as it's supported, and always be on the latest. SAP would always want you to be on the latest fix of that newest version too. Now, that's not always possible, but unless you've got plans in place to be able to implement these changes, again, you're just getting further behind. We've heard of some customers recently that are still on HANA 1. HANA 1 is totally end of support now, end of life. Any problems that they get, the first thing from SAP will be upgrade. And that's a huge amount of change. If you're still on HANA 1, you want to go to HANA 2, that's not an easy task. Okay. Finally, a little bit on automation with some more flashy animation for you. Okay, so I'm going to sort of compare for you a little bit here what a manual deployment would be like compared to an automated deployment. So I've done probably more manual builds than I have had hot desserts. So at one point, a lot of my job was building BWA blades, and sometimes it'd be 10 or 20 blades at a time, all of which were largely manual. And what I would do is I would get out the latest cookbook, and I would follow the instructions. So I'd get my servers, and I'd start deploying the elements on there. I'd put on the operating system, some configuration, hook up and configure the storage, do the application install, do the application tuning, and some testing. So a whole bunch of multiple components. And as I did it, I'd be writing my own little instructions for myself or for a colleague in order to do this same bunch of tasks again on the next system. Of course, the next system comes along and either me or my colleagues pick up these systems, and you make slight mistakes because you are a human being. And yeah, we're not very good at doing repetitive tasks. So over time, if you build enough systems, they will start being different from each other in very subtle ways. Now, maybe it's a line in a text file that you haven't escaped correctly. Maybe it's, a 0 where it should be a 1, a true where it should be a false. All these things are really difficult to track down later on if you've got performance problems, or if you've got something that works in dev that doesn't work in QA, or works in QA and doesn't work in prod. So having really well built, really consistent systems is an absolute must, really, especially for an enterprise application like SAP. So when we do this with automation, what we do is we write the definition up front. And that means that not only is it the same every time we do it, we can also install in parallel. So we can build systems rather than one at a time with somebody behind a keyboard. We can build them 30 at a time, 40 at a time, 100 at a time. It really doesn't matter. And we know the results are always going to be the same. But also, we talked a little bit earlier about using automation, not just at build, but at runtime as well. And that's really important because, say, back on my manual system, I've got a patch I need to install. I need to change my top right square to white from blue. Well, hopefully I'll do it the same on every system, but sometimes systems get missed, sometimes updates get installed incorrectly. But again, with the automation, I can do it, consistently every single time. And that's what we mean about not just for build time, automation all the time. In terms of automation, the tools we use, we mainly use two tools, Terraform and Ansible. Terraform is used for infrastructure as code, basically. So we can provision networking, virtual machines, load balancers, any platform as a service or software as a service, bits of Azure that we use. We can do all that with Terraform. And we use Ansible for everything that is done at an operating system level. So we can install, configure operating systems, all the tuning parameters. We can do software install and configuration with Ansible as well. And these are sort of the two major tools in the automation tool set that most customers most broadly adopted by the community. Not just SAP, but the community as a whole. And that's really important as well, because some of the GSIs, they've gone out and they've built their own tools. And really, when you build your own tools, you just build your own bugs, really. It's another thing that you've got to build, control, and maintain. And it's difficult. Software development is difficult. I mean, we see that all the time. So by using industry standard tools that are open source and developed by the community, it really means that we solve a lot of those problems a lot quicker. Conclude really about the CFI. So regardless of the target application and the target level that you're going to, you might be sticking with, SQL database today on Windows, you might be going to ECC on HANA, you might be going to S4. Regardless of any of those decisions, the CFI provides a highly standardized platform for the majority of SAP applications. So it doesn't matter what you're doing, we've got CFI solutions that will fit that at any level of availability, any level of DR. It's more or less a jigsaw that is very easy to put together. And with that, I'm going to cede control and hand back over to Kieran for the last part of the presentation.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Claire, for going into that for us. So, anyway, thanks to Claire and Steve for running through those approaches in much more detail. So, for our conclusion, I'd like to recap and compare the customer experience between the two common cloud adoption strategies. So, but specifically against those top 3 cloud adoption priorities that we highlighted earlier on. So starting with the number 1 priority, the acceleration of innovation. So with the lift and shift approach, we've covered how it mirrors the on-premise setup. So this limits the acceleration of innovation as a lot of technical debt is taken to the cloud. A broad set of OSs, databases and tools are taken over, and this makes automation a lot more difficult and less effective, further limiting the agility that can be achieved with the cloud. Clearly, you can still be more agile by being in the cloud, but you can't quite achieve the same levels of agility that you could with the migrate and transform approach. So with this strategy, the migrate and transform approach, significant amounts of that technical debt are removed during the migration, and then systems are managed with a short infrastructure lifecycle. So removing the time, risk, commercial barriers, and unlocking that agility that the cloud can give you and that businesses are demanding. On the second priority, so improving operational excellence, with the lift and shift approach, again, the mix of platform technologies makes managing key business continuity processes such as HA and DR really quite difficult to test and then use when needed. Patching and upgrades, again, remain unnecessarily complex, resulting in large periods of downtime, as Steve evidenced. And this prevents the business from improving regular patching and maintenance windows, meaning technical debt just continues to grow and grow. Problem isolation is also difficult, which impacts your stability, so clearly impacting operations. With the migrate and transform approach, organizations are now really easily testing key business processes like HADR with no business impact, building up that confidence in those processes, making the operations more effective. And patching and upgrades, again, is implemented with minimal to no business impact. Again, this helps to ensure that infrastructural lifecycle remains short, and then again, ensure systems remain stable whilst simultaneously delivering that accelerated innovation that priority demand. And that's where, as Steve mentioned earlier, the world of DevOps was founded, and the use of things like automation becomes really, really powerful. Finally, cost optimization. The lift and shift approach takes these systems as is. So systems are typically oversized, more systems deployed than are perhaps necessary, and that significantly impacts the cloud bill. So managed service partners like us actually base our costs on the number of tickets, which is driven by complexity, the effort associated with managing it from a systems administration perspective, effort to upgrade, and so on and so forth. And this approach is suboptimal, and subsequently the end customer unfairly foots the bill for that, with high support costs from the same partners that have migrated these systems over into the cloud or wherever it's being hosted. With migrate and transform, system designs are actually optimized for cloud, and as Claire said on numerous occasions, with a modern delivery framework, managed service partners like Centiq hugely simplify the effort to manage SAP systems, and we should, and we do, and I'm sure others do, pass that benefit back to the customer, which reduces that TCO, which is why you saw with the example that we presented earlier on during Claire's section, that TCO reduced by over 20%. So that was a 7-figure saving, pretty much a 50-50 split between the infrastructure costs going down and the managed service costs going down as well. And it's when you look at that bigger picture that you start to really see that reduced TCO. These differing approaches and customer experiences apply equally to the 2 common adoption strategies we discussed earlier. So those companies using cloud as the platform for S4 now, or those delaying the move to S4 but looking to realise the benefits of cloud now for ECC. And for the latter, this migrate and transform approach holds further benefit to those companies. So particularly looking one's particularly looking to migrate to S4 through a system conversion brownfield approach. So running back again through those three key drivers, from an innovation perspective, as Claire and Steve both mentioned, we're seeing customers who've migrated ECC to Azure now leveraging the scalability of really heavily automated SAP and Azure deployment to spin up sandboxes in Azure, to test the actual migration to S4, start to get a feel for the new user experience through SAP Fiori, and to explore, modernizing those business processes. This is, of course, again, possible with lift and shift, but it's far quicker and more cost effective with the migrate and transform approach. The benefits of improved operational effectiveness with the migrate and transform approach, particularly the low technical debt, hugely simplifies the future migration to S4 for obvious reasons in terms of minimizing those prerequisites, which can often be a huge amount of the work and cost associated. And then finally, those costs to migrate and run to S4 in the future becomes really optimized through this approach. So business confidence is established through experimenting with the sandbox, and low technical debt keeps the steps to a minimum. as we've discussed, and all this helps to minimize resources in terms of both people and budget. And the temporary use of things like dual track systems really reduce the infrastructure bill. To migrate to S4, reserved instances on ECC systems can be repurposed for your S4 systems, meaning you don't pay twice like you would in a traditional sort of on-premise or a private hosted approach. And as Claire mentioned earlier, there's a few other advantages here as well in terms of the sandboxes on a temporary basis, or ramping up your systems during the migration to accelerate the cutover and really keep that business impact down. And again, that all adds up to the cost. It might be someone else's budget, but again, it's just keeping that cost optimized. So pretty much brings us to the end of the presentation. I trust that throughout this session, we've highlighted why so many organizations are turning to the cloud, and the comparisons that we've presented here highlight the difference in the customer experience between just simply lifting and shifting versus a more modern migrate and transform approach. And we hope this reinforces why it's so important to adopt a more cloud native strategy when moving SAP to the cloud. And yeah, as I said, that pretty much concludes the session. So I don't know if you've had any questions through the session, or if anyone has any questions now. I'll give it a few seconds, and then I can move on. Bex can present the last slide.
We've not had anything in the chat, so
No worries. I'm sure it's because Claire and Steve have answered all the questions, so we're all good.
we just click over to the next one.
Yeah.
Just a quick call to action, really. If anybody is interested, we're taking their first steps on a migrate and transform approach. We are running a service that we call the Transformation Roadmap. It's non-committal, it's free of charge. The link just on that slide will take you through to the landing page, where we just ask you to fill out a simple form and just upload and send us a copy of an early watch report. And the team will then be in touch just to book in probably about an hour's worth of your time to discuss your SAP landscape in a little bit more detail, just to get some more context around how you use it and what you're looking to achieve. And then we provide you with a high-level report of recommendations of how to kind of kickstart your journey for transformation with SAP. So please use that as you need to. I hope you've enjoyed today's session. Thank you for your time. Thank you to the speakers. Well done, guys. That was great. The slides and the recording will be sent to you probably tomorrow. And if there's any questions, please do get in touch.